And now it's time for the big close of The Stranger by Albert Camus, chapter 5 of part 2, the last chapter of the book, in which everything gets kind of real. So, this chapter brings up all sorts of things, and all of the major themes of the text come full circle. All of the reasons why this is considered to be one of the most influential books of the last 100 years are blown up right in our faces, where we have to ask ourselves all the tough questions about fate, free will, justice, absurdity, reality, the whole deal, ethics, how we behave, and what is morally right versus what is morally wrong. Also chance and luck and all of these other things, and how we deal with religion and the nature of God and truth and all of that. It's all in here, and it all comes to a head in this chapter. This chapter starts off, interestingly enough, just with the idea of taking interest in executions when they happen. Meursault says, something along the lines of, you never know what's going to happen. And I think that that's a particularly sort of compelling issue, because in truth, you never know what's going to happen, and any of us could end up in a tough situation at any given point. He also brings up the absurdity and the chance of the idea that the fact that the sentence had been read at 8 o'clock at night and not at 5 o'clock, the fact that it could have been an entirely different one, the fact that it had been decided by men who changed their underwear, the fact that it had been handed down in the name of some vague notion called the French or German or Chinese people, all of it seemed to detract from the seriousness of the decision. All of these aspects of our lives sort of seem absurd when they're actually sort of put there right in front of us. There are some other interesting things about Meursault brought up in this chapter, such as the fact that he didn't know his father, and we have to consider necessarily whether that makes a difference or not in the way he ended up turning out. There's also the idea that really, it said, how had I not seen that there was nothing more important than an execution, and that when you come right down to it, it was the only thing a man could truly be interested in, which is a pretty sort of compelling issue, that ultimately, at the end of the day, death is the only real issue. He also brings up the really kind of fascinating moral implications of the death penalty, and it makes sort of a clean argument against it, sort of how there's a paradox innate in the model, in that the person who is on death row must necessarily hope that their execution goes smoothly, because the idea of it not going smoothly means that it would be protracted and more painful. So it makes, in sort of a strange way, the person who is condemned to death kind of a moral accomplice in their own execution. That's sort of a paradoxical element that conflates the whole notion of execution as punishment, because the person who's being punished has to agree with the punishment and hope it is carried out swiftly and cleanly. There's also the issue that he says, and this is one of those things where he brings up beautiful issues and beautiful ideas that you might not have expected from him, such as the idea that when he is sitting there awaiting his possible execution, he hears more sounds than ever, and saying that his mother was right. Once again, another mention of his mother, who is, of course, in many ways, one of the key reasons that he ended up being found guilty, in that he hears more sounds than ever, and he remembers his mother's advice that there's always something to be happy about. It also brings up the theme of acceptance, that ultimately, now or in the future, everybody is going to die, and therefore the time and place of it is really kind of irrelevant, because at the end of the day, there's just not too terribly much that can be done about it. We're all in this situation together. And that fact that we're all in this situation together is something that gives it a sort of uniformity and beauty, and also, in a sense, a condemnation to all of our situation. So one thing that's key is the fact that Meursault is an atheist. This is obviously a huge issue, sort of a huge elephant in the room that we've dodged a little bit so far. So we can sort of look at that and sort of analyze that and consider necessarily what that means for him. He had refused to see the chaplain on multiple occasions, but now here at the end, the chaplain sort of shows up uninvited, and we finally get these two opposing sides of people dealing with each other face to face. So in a sense, the chaplain, through Meursault's view, is under the impression that we're all condemned from the beginning. And in a sense, this means that in sort of a twisted way, the chaplain and Meursault actually agree with each other despite themselves. Of course, Meursault says that he doesn't have time for God, and he also doesn't believe in the afterlife. So that brings up some particularly troubling things for people who are of belief. It also raises the issue of human versus divine justice. And then when, Meursault sees Marie's face in the stones, what necessarily that represents. Whether he really did love her all along and he just really didn't know what love was, or whether he's just lusting at her. It becomes sort of a complicated thing. So when he's talking to the chaplain, it brings up this complicated issue in which the chaplain asks, do you really love the earth so much that you don't want to believe in the afterlife? And Meursault sort of is under the impression that wishing for another life is the same as wishing to be rich. So there's a lot to be said about whether wishing to be rich is in fact the same as wishing for an afterlife. But that's sort of a question to debate yourself, because there's a lot of complexity there, and in some ways that's a profoundly heretical idea, but you can also sort of witness the logic of it. So when Meursault, in sort of the climactic scene, does blow up sort of in the face of this chaplain, we, for the first time, really, truly, and in an impressive, hardcore fashion, get to see Meursault's stoicism completely and totally wash away and is replaced by this profound anger, in which, there's the idea of free will, whether Meursault can actually choose as he pleases, whether anything matters at all, whether we're all in it together, the idea that all human beings, regardless of your life, we're all sort of privileged. The notion that the future, like fate, is sort of a magnet pulling him towards something, that it can't be stopped. And then, at the very end, this whole entire profound section in which people have spent entire careers academically trying to figure out what to make of the last few sentences of this work. So I find them to be profoundly beautiful. For the first time in a long time, I thought about Mammon. I felt as if I understood why at the end of her life she had taken a fiancé, why she had played at beginning again. Even there, in that home where lives were fading out, evening was a kind of wistful respite. So close to death, Mammon must have felt free then and ready to live it all again. Nobody had the right to cry over her. And I felt ready to live it all again too, as if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope. For the first time in that night alive with signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world. Finding it so much like myself, so like a brother really, I felt that I had been happy and that I was happy again. This whole entire realization brings it all full circle. Finally, we get a justification, a true, legitimate justification for Meursault not crying at his mother's funeral. This isn't to say that he felt this way at the beginning, but upon his own deathbed, he realizes that his mother's life was something beautiful and happy and joyous, and that because of that, nobody should mourn for her. She shouldn't be mourned for, she should be celebrated. And that sort of realization wakes him up. He's been indifferent his whole life, and here he is on the precipice of the end of it, and he wants to live it all again. There's something incredibly moving and amazing about that. In that, really, this whole entire idea of whether he's an atheist, what that necessarily means, whether it's an example of darkness, whether he is a villain. That's a big issue in this book. Is Meursault the hero, or is he a villain? It's a very difficult thing. After all, he did kill somebody completely unprovoked, but then we follow him along through this whole entire tale, and you can't help but feel something for him when he's here, waiting in this cell to die. And he has this sort of beautiful realization where he's considering fate, free will, chance, the ability to make anything make sense in the world. And in a way, you're sort of forced to root for him, even if he is in fact a murderer, even if he is in fact a terrible monster. So it all sort of comes to a head in which he has this amazing realization about his mother, and then bang, we get the last sentence, the toughest sentence of all, and one of the most complicated sentences to unpack for meaning of all literature. For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone, I had only to wish that there be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they greet me with cries of hate. Man, that is a rough sentence to deal with, isn't it? It's very, very difficult to figure out what he means by this. Why would he want people to greet him with cries of hate? One of the possible interpretations is that because earlier, the only time in the story that he really felt like crying was when he realized how much everybody hated him, that all he needs for him to totally accept death, and in a way, for him to be enlightened, for him to achieve an enlightenment, an awakening, a peace, sort of an atheist salvation for himself. He needs to be able to accept all that fate and all that chance and all that the world has given him. So the one thing that he seems to fear most, the one thing that elicited in him the desire to cry, was the realization that people hated him. So for him to be able to accept, for him to be able to be enlightened, for everything that he's experienced to be truly consummated, he needs to be able to accept the idea that upon his execution, people are going to be hating him and jeering at him and cheering his death. That for him to be able to take that into himself and accept it, that's the one thing that he needs to do to fully come full circle and to achieve a sense of enlightenment. Man, that is a lot to deal with. So this book obviously raises lots of humongous issues that are sort of difficult to deal with, that are emotionally complex, that are incredibly rich, and are examples of an existentialist text. Existentialism, in a sense, one of the major tenets of it is that you make your own purpose in life. It's not up to anybody else to decide what the meaning of your life is. It's not religion's job to decide the meaning of your life. It's not your parents' job to decide. It's not society's job to decide. It's up to you to figure out the purpose of your life. And in a sense, Meursault, his sort of lasting realization at the end, maybe that is him finally achieving that sort of existentialist enlightenment. Just as another thing to keep in mind about Albert Camus, the author of this book. He's somebody who had gone through and witnessed many of the horrors of World War II. This book takes place, obviously, in Algeria. That's where Camus was from. He spoke French there. He was somebody who, was of French descent, living in Algeria. And tragically, and somewhat ironically, given the nature of this book, Camus himself actually died in a car accident of the age of 47, well before the actual end of his life should have come. So it brings up all of these issues of mortality, accepting death, enlightenment, and it's all there in this book, The Stranger.